Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Anderson. I'm the project director of American Roundtable, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. For those of you new to American Roundtable, it is a project of the Architectural League that brings together on-the-ground perspectives on the condition of American small to mid-sized communities and what they need to thrive going forward. The proposition at the heart of the initiative is that too often our understanding of rural areas and small cities is reduced to caricature and oversimplification. So our hope is to highlight, in all their complexity and nuance, communities often overlooked, and to provide platforms for individuals and organizations to share their stories and work imagining, understanding, and improving their local built environments. The core of American Roundtable is a set of 9 commissioned reports, each looking at a different community or region in the United States. The first 2 reports on West Virginia and Lower Rio Grande, New Mexico have been digitally published, and the others are forthcoming through the spring. I don't want to take too much time away from today's presentations and discussion, so I encourage you to visit archleague.org to learn more about the entire initiative and to explore both reports. Complementing these 9 reports will be a series of programs allowing for extended discussion and conversation with each reports as editors and contributors, which brings us to today and the first of these presentations and discussions. Appalachia Rising looks at communities across West Virginia and argues for a new, optimistic, land-based narrative for West Virginia's future. The report was conceived by editor Nina Chase, and today we have the pleasure of hearing from her, along with 2 of her report's contributors, Caroline Felice Smith and Elaine McMillion Sheldon. After we hear from Nina, Caroline, and Elaine, I'll be joined by the League's executive director, Rosalie Genevro, and the 5 of us will discuss their report. We do hope to take some questions from the audience at that time, so please add any questions to the Zoom Q&A feature. Nina Chase, in addition to serving as the editor for Appalachia Rising, is a principal and co-founder of Merit Chase, a landscape architecture and research practice based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. A native of Morgantown, West Virginia, Chase is a graduate of West Virginia University and Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. She works across Appalachia to plan and design public realm projects, including regional park master plans, riverfront parks, and trail systems. Caroline Felice Smith is a researcher at Harvard University, where she is pursuing a PhD in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning. Her research is centered on debt, risk, and uncertainty in Central Appalachia, with a focus on histories of infrastructural development and the ways class and racism intersect in the production of America's rural and urban built environments. Her family hails from Eastern Kentucky. Elaine McMillian Sheldon is an Academy Award-nominated Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker and a native of West Virginia. She is the director of 2 Netflix original documentaries, Heroine and Recovery Boys. Both explore America's opioid crisis with a focus on West Virginians who are providing hopeful examples of community building across the state. And with that, I will turn things over to Nina.
Thanks, Nick. Let's see. I'm gonna share my screen. Can everybody see my screen okay? All right. Thanks, Nick. And thank you, everybody out there, for joining in today. I also want to just say a special thank you to Nick and Rosalie and the team at the Architectural League for their support and commitment to the American Roundtable project. Over the course of almost a year now, the project and the people and the process have really been a bright spot in an otherwise very, very challenging year. And as Rosalie highlighted in her intro essay for the project, which is on the Architectural League's website, I think collectively the reports really offer a glimmer of hope and a sense of understanding of our time right now. And I think as designers, we're eternal optimists, and we kind of have to be, because our job is to envision and then realize futures. And the pandemic has made us all very acutely aware that it's really hard to dedicate time to plan for a future when your day-to-day is really spent on immediate risks. And as designers, I think we have an incredible responsibility and privilege to spend our time and use our tools to offer optimism, especially today. So thank you to the Architectural League for giving a platform for that optimism and hope. As Nick mentioned, I'm Nina Chase. I'm a West Virginian living in Pittsburgh, and I'm the co-founder of a landscape architecture practice, Merritt Chase, founded by myself and my business partner, Chris Merritt. And I'm thrilled to be sharing the screen this afternoon with Caroline and Elaine. Both Caroline and Elaine are contributors to our Appalachia Rising report, and we're all going to each dive a little deeper into our portion of the report over the course of the next 25, 30 minutes. So with that, I wanted to share a little bit more about our report. And I'll start with an excerpt from a letter written by Anne Pancake, who's an author and a resident of West Virginia. And is, as part of our initial work for the report, we asked residents to write letters to future family members who might be living in the state of West Virginia 100 years from today, in the year 2120. And so Anne wrote a beautiful a letter that was almost, I think, 3 or 4 pages long, but this is just a snippet. Dear Alexander, they say salamanders are one of those beings that can't survive what we've done to our places. A sensitive species, a coal mine canary. That's why I think of you 100 years from now, playing in your own West Virginia creek, Alexander Salamander. After 2020, the whole country upended. You'll learn that history soon if you don't know it yet. By the time Jack's son, your grandfather, finished school in 2050, West Virginia was a better place to make a life than California was. You see, what happened here first eventually happened everywhere else. And because we had so much practice with things falling apart, West Virginians through it all held on to their best qualities: decency, integrity, kindness, generosity. Our hope, though, is by inviting folks to write letters to future family members as part of this project, that they would be inspired and kind of given a mental freedom to envision alternative futures for their state 100 years from today. And as I kind of briefly touched on at the beginning, I think our jobs as designers of the built world is really to imagine futures. And as landscape architects, we work to imagine futures for landscapes and then build them. These are outdoor spaces and often public spaces in the world. And a lot of our work as a firm revolves around the idea of adding meaning to public spaces and possibly expanding what you might consider to be a valuable landscape. And often that change involves really changing public perception around and building momentum for investment in landscapes or land-based projects that can help celebrate an identity of a place. And so with that in mind, our goal for our report has really been to build momentum for an alternative future for West Virginia and a future for communities that essentially reframes the value of land. In the past and in the present, in many places in the state, land is valued as a natural resource to exploit and extract, but there is a growing movement from within the state by West Virginians to value land for other purposes, maybe for its beauty or for its recreational potential or its potential to create new green jobs or for climate change mitigation possibilities. And for those that are familiar, you know that West Virginia is really defined by its land, the hills and the hollers and the valleys and the rivers and the creeks and the forests. They've all been deeply embedded in the culture of communities for generations. But the accumulated depletion of these natural resources has really perpetuated a cycle of boom and bust throughout the state's history, not dissimilar to many towns across the country. And this rhythm it's left landscapes scarred, it's left communities abandoned, and for many generations, it's been struggling to redefine the future. And so we posited what if the shared kind of generational reverence for land is leveraged instead towards planning and designing new relationships with the state's natural resources and its natural beauty, and that kind of thinking about how on the same ground that once harbored the most diverse ecosystems in the entire country, West Virginia's landscapes could really once again be framed as the state's greatest asset. And to do that, in our report, we framed the report kind of in 2 parts. The first being documentation of existing places in the state, and the second documenting and kind of proposing alternative futures. For the first part, existing places, we worked with an incredible collaborator team to document existing land-based projects currently operating across the state, and that Caroline and Elaine both contributed to that piece of the project. And then, and some of those projects included new forms of infrastructure and recreational landscapes. There are reforestation initiatives, urban agriculture, renovated public spaces. all great things that are happening already. And then the second part of the report was really inspired by the letters written by West Virginians. We took and kind of built upon the ideas and visualized what those land-based alternative futures could look like. So as I mentioned, the majority of our report is really dedicated to cataloging existing places and these emerging projects that are already happening. And we did that through the 5 themes of the American Roundtable project. So infrastructure, health, work and economy, environment, and public space each have basically a chapter. And each of the incredible all-woman team of Appalachian documentarians took one of those themes and through a variety of different mediums expressed kind of an alternative narrative for West Virginia by focusing on work that's happening right now. So we had Caroline, who was focused on infrastructure, Elaine, who was looking at health, Brittany Patterson, who was a reporter for West Virginia Public Radio on work and economy, Rebecca Kiger, who's an award-winning West Virginia photographer, and then our office, Mary Chase, looking at public space. We also had Point Line Projects, who's out of Pittsburgh, Sarah Rapson and Candace Opper, who provided editorial support. And so all of these projects that we were looking at kind of run the gamut across the entire state and focused on reframing the state's relationship with land. And so what we wanted to do was share a little bit more about some of those projects and kick it off with Caroline giving a little bit of a deeper dive into some of her work, which really helped set the stage for an understanding of land use in the state through the lens of infrastructural history and how infrastructure had developed over the course of the state's history. So Caroline, I have some slides here for you, but you can take it away.
Great, thank you, Nina. So as Nina mentioned, the publication is really organized around Imagine Futures. So it was interesting when we decided that my contribution would be looking towards the past. So maybe I take a minute to explain the logic behind that. For folks not familiar with Appalachia, it has a very long, deep history of being understood through what we would call a culture of poverty lens. So folks tend to look at Appalachia and the struggles it faces through a lens which kind of pathologizes the land. So the mountains keep out development, they prevent modernization, and it has led to a people who are very much stuck in time and who can be blamed for a lot of the misfortunes that are found in this place. And this is very much what was happening even in the 60s when the war on poverty really starts in this region of the country. And so we decided that it would be important to kind of take a step back and challenge this still dominant narrative that you find with people like J.D. Vance, and lots of other scholars have been pushing against it, just to think very critically and try to identify like what are the projects and processes that constructed the current situation. Because if we can identify the projects and processes by which our current situation was made, then we can also find ways to unmake it or remake it. So our ability to imagine a future is a way dependent on our ability to understand how the present was made to begin with, and to kind of excavate and cast away some of these more superficial and really biased narratives. And so if we can move to the next one, Nina. So the infrastructural piece that I contributed starts with a story about Vulcan, West Virginia, which is in the southern coal fields. And I kind of decided to use it as an archetype to tell the story of how much of West Virginia was, I would say, urbanized or developed infrastructurally. And so it's a story of a very small town, a coal community developed solely for coal, that in the 1970s, at the height of the Cold War, loses its only public access to the kind of quote unquote outside world, foot suspension bridge that falls into the water, and residents kind of struggle to get new funding from the state, from the federal government. They find nothing, and so they call the Russians, and which seems like an extreme kind of solution, but it works. They call the Russians, a Russian reporter comes to town. At the site of this, the US government steps in and builds a new bridge, finds the funding. And so it's a funny anecdote, but it really kind of, in explaining how that came to be, we can start to understand the history of infrastructural development and urban development in the state, which is really led by private industry. So we have the kind of turn of the 20th century, coal is booming. Much of the state has already been sold through land speculation, even prior to the Revolutionary War. So West Virginia has always, in a way, been a place where people kind of bank their money in the land. And when coal was booming, it became profitable to start building rail lines and other kinds of infrastructures deep into the hollows, however we want to call it. And because it was a kind of risky financial investment and involved quite a bit of labor, so the labor force involved in mining coal was, there were a lot of people needed for underground mining. We started to have a lot of coal camps. So they're kind of isolated from other communities in an effort to control labor, but also, these are all independent infrastructural networks being built in because of the kind of wanting to privatize the cost. And so this just led to a lot of really isolated communities, a high percentage, it's like 80-something% of the coal towns in the early 20th century were private. And so if we go to the next slide, what ends up happening is you kind of have a siloing of communities in these small haulers and a siloing of the sorts of infrastructures that feed them. So a place like Vulcan, it has no public road access. It has only a private rail network that when in the 50s, the coal industry goes into a bust, they stop offering passenger service, and then all of a sudden you have a town that has no way of exiting itself. And this is kind of repeated throughout the state, and it makes it really difficult for a state to manage a kind of network of road and rail that isn't built to connect to itself, but is actually built to kind of isolate from one another. And as the bust continues through the 20th and into the 21st century, much of this infrastructure was then offloaded onto the state, which didn't have the funds. And we can get into this, how the kind of tax system for land in West Virginia has contributed to a lack of funds to maintain this infrastructure that was originally private, but was kind of like offloaded onto the state. And so you kind of end up with the situation of isolated communities, isolated infrastructure, and not much money to support its maintenance. And if we can go to the next one, Nina, which goes then ends, and I end the piece in this question of landscape infrastructure, which brings us back to the kind of publication's main theme, but it's really this question of short-term versus long-term investment, the question of understanding infrastructure, not as just rail and road and sewage, but rather as the base from which we build our futures. And that's kind of the original definition of infrastructure. So to think of the land in West Virginia as kind of the base from which we build. So it's not a resource to be extracted and taken away, but it's something that requires a long-term investment, a long-term view. And in this way, and I hope we get to this, it kind of hooks into these new scales of funding and thinking that intersect with questions of climate change and our ability to kind of adapt long-term. So.
Thanks, Caroline. So Elaine, I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about your piece for the project. Elaine contributed a short documentary film addressing public health in West Virginia by showcasing the work of a West Virginia University public health researcher and his advocacy towards investment in recreational outdoor programs to improve public health outcomes in the state. So if you wanted to give a little bit of an intro, and then we have a short clip from the video we're going to show.
Yeah, I think I might just use my next 3 minutes to say what I'm going to say, and we'll end with the clip if that's cool.
That's perfect, yeah.
So yeah, I'm Elaine. I grew up in Logan, West Virginia, which is in the coal fields. My dad was a coal miner until he retired. My brother still works in the coal mines in McDowell County. And so it's always been I've always had this interesting relationship with the boom and bust cycles. I moved, 10 times before I was in 6th grade because of layoffs and shutdowns in the mines. And so that whole relationship of our unstable economy, mono economy has been imprinted on me. But my relationship with nature as a kid, I see still reflected in children's lives today whose parents uphold traditions, largely influenced by camping trips at Chief Logan State Park, or biking in the woods, or building forts, or planting gardens with my grandma, or picking wild berries. And I left West Virginia in 2009, and I've lived in DC and Boston and Miami. And it was in those places that I started understanding my role in what is a contested term, but is a term called brain drain of youth, young people leaving, not returning. And so in 2012, I came back to work with these kids in McDowell County and the community in McDowell County to make a project called Hollow, which is a lot of the footage you'll see in the documentary here in a moment was based on. And then in 2017, looking at a different health crisis, made 2 films about the opioid crisis and the public health issues that are around that. And like it's been said already, land has really been thought of in terms of how it could be used. It's not allowed to just be. It has to serve a purpose for financial gain for someone. And even thinking about the natural gas boom now, these new spaces that used to be fields of wildflowers that are now gravel, and you see them just holding massive equipment. They're spaces that are being used, or the houses that are having to be cradled on both sides near Grafton, West Virginia, because the coal mine pillars underneath them are literally caving in, and their houses might cave in with it. So this has been going on for a long time, but something that has less power and less attention is the traditions of people in Appalachia that has been one around self-sufficiency and understanding resources beyond these natural resources we extract. So before big companies, separated people from their land that they used to hunt and forage on, each generation had their ways of life, whether that was ginseng or ramps, and that still goes on, but I think it has less power. And I even see that within my own family, that loss of that generational knowledge that we're losing. And so what Alf Gear is doing at WVU, which is reconnecting people back to land, water, resources as a way to improve public health, is so inspiring for me, because it's important that we reconnect locals to those recreational resources. The number of West Virginians that still haven't experienced Seneca Rocks and Deli Sods and these places that are in their own state is too many. We often see these places as things that people from DC take advantage of, but not locally. And so I think that this program he's doing is going to do one that's going to be one that actually reinstates the value of these places for locals and actually invites them into spaces that are theirs. Another thing that I think needs to happen, and Caroline mentioned it with the infrastructure side, but it's also a long-term investment in people, not just in land and resources. But when you have an economy that's built on this boom and bust system, it really cages you in this psychological relationship with your day-to-day life of things feeling risky and uncertain, right? And so planning long-term is a challenge. And it's only made worse by well-meaning programs and people from the outside coming in to fix us, right? So they can lay linoleum down or put a new roof on a house or feed children for 1 week as part of a mission group, and then they're gone. And so we need stability in our future for our kids and especially for our health. I think the public health of Appalachia really depends on long-term investment in people. So I want to show this clip. It's about 2 or 3 minutes. And then thank you guys for being here.
Thanks, Elaine.
The third thing that Iceland has done almost everywhere is massively invest in organized leisure time opportunities, which is massively needed in West Virginia. Kids that grow up in areas where there is more or less nothing like that available to them, they have to find and carve out their route themselves. The most reliable infrastructure to extend leisure time opportunities are the schools. We will use what and should be using and utilizing our assets. The nature and beauty of West Virginia is a big asset, and there's plenty of ways to utilize that space better, from further trailing to fishing to mountain biking. You ask them, what do you really would like to do more of? They're not asking for any fireworks or regular trips to Disneyland. They're just asking for, I would love if I could do this regularly. And usually it's something in their immediate environment. Archery, kayaking, keeping the swimming pool open a little bit longer. These are things that can relatively easily be acquired.
I remember they had Girl Scouts when I was younger, but we didn't really do much. Even starting scout clubs and stuff like that again, and having them go on hikes and do more nature-centered stuff would be a good idea. I love going on hikes, or I can't remember the name of the state park, but I went there a couple weeks ago and they had like a waterfall, and I love doing stuff like that. I do feel better. It's like I feel calmer, and I feel like when I'm out there, I'm like, oh, like this hike's gonna take like an hour, but like when I'm out there walking, I don't even really count the time. It just passes by, you know.
What I really would hope to show is that what we are doing works and will show impact. And if it does, then I want to go to the state government and say, let's stop, just stop all the short-term programs. Just change your mindset. Think about systems and infrastructure.
I just want to clarify, the girl speaking on her phone, I forgot to recognize who she is. Her name's Marla Brown. In 2012, she was one of the kids I worked with in Keystone. She was 10 years old at the time. Now she's 18 and she's in college. And if you go watch the full film, you can sort of learn more about her trajectory, about what she thinks helped her find stability within her own family and community. And also just a special note, like I mentioned, nature being a part of my childhood. That last drone shot that pulls out, that's actually my grandma's property where I would spend summers. And so those are my little cousins on there. And so it's something that, you know, I live in Knoxville now, so I'm not in West Virginia. I moved here last summer, and my heart aches to be away, but I also know like where I can contribute and where I can't. And so my family continues to live on the same land. And I think that that's something really powerful that has been belittled culturally in America, that people aren't willing to move or aren't smart enough to get out. And at the same time, there's been 9 generations of my family maintaining land. And I think that that's really beautiful. And I'm glad that they're still there.
Thank you, Elaine. That was beautiful. So I wanted to share a little bit of the other profiles that are featured in the report, and so I'll go through these because I know we want some time for conversation, but I'll go through these kind of quickly. Brittany Patterson profiled 3 experimental land-based projects that provide both benefits from an economic and ecological standpoint, and probably more importantly for this piece, thinking about novel work opportunities. So her piece features 3 different projects: the Cheat River Restoration, the Spruce Forest Restoration, and the Turn Row Appalachian Farm Collective for that component. I won't go into too much detail, but there's a lot of great content, and she did it through photography and writing and audio. And then Rebecca Kiger's piece, Rebecca is a photographer out of Wheeling, West Virginia. And she captured the impact of an urban agriculture initiative called Grow Ohio Valley in Wheeling. And in this image, you can see Wheeling, West Virginia in the background, and then the farm actually in the foreground here on a hillside. There are the greenhouses and then a yurt here. And the organization's led by Danny Swan, who with his team has been repurposing a variety of urban environments, vacant lots, hillsides, as you saw, very steep hillsides, vineyards, and even under highway overpasses for food production. And it started with urban farming, but then in tandem, as he was producing the food, was realizing that there was actually more of a need for food distribution and equitable food distribution and equitable access to healthy food. And so in tandem with kind of maximizing the potential of these vacant lots, he's also been building out a really robust food distribution network that includes a mobile food market and also a brick and mortar public market in downtown Wheeling that's connected very closely to the bus station there. And Rebecca spent time over the course of the last year with Danny, his team, and his family. This is his son here in the foreground, documenting the impact of this project on the land in Wheeling and on the people and who the food impacts across the city. And then for the public space theme, my team and I at Merritt Chase, we focused on public space and offered different perspectives on 3 different scales of public spaces that have been able to kind of reposition and celebrate the unique identity of the state over a wide range of time. And we looked at the history of the Monongahela National Forest, which is one of the landscapes that Elaine was mentioning, that offers a regional example of preservation and conservation efforts in Eastern West Virginia, and it includes some of the kind of original Green Jobs programs, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which dives into a little more detail in the report, but kind of has some parallels to the Green New Deal and some thoughts about new jobs opportunities as part of that. We also looked at the Hatfield and Mccoy trail system in the southern coalfields of West Virginia. And this is a multi-county effort to connect over 700 miles of ATV trails on both public and private land. So it's an interesting example of public-private partnerships, kind of recreating wholly new uses on formerly mined mountaintop land. And then we also featured some of our own work in Morgantown, West Virginia, my hometown, and also home to West Virginia University, where the recent renovation of Hazel Ruby McLean Riverfront Park, which is the riverfront park in the city, became a really nice model for collective community process. And you can see some images here, and also design advocacy at its core that resulted in renewed investment in civic infrastructure on the Monongahela River, and this opened this summer. And hopefully we'll be able to get back out there this year and celebrate with everybody. Lastly, we did want to share the kind of second part of this proposal was about positioning alternative futures. And so in addition to documenting the existing places and the people who are doing things right now about land to serve kind of as inspirational precedents, we also visualized if we continue to build off of those ideas, what could the future of West Virginia look like? And these ideas, as I mentioned, were built off of and were inspired by the collective input by current West Virginians and former West Virginians when we invited folks to kind of shape these alternative futures by writing letters to their future family members. These are some of the letters here. They were incredible. And I actually don't think we uploaded all of them in full for the report, and we probably should do that, Nick. We could add that to the growing list of stuff that we can do. But a number of the ideas included a post-carbon future filled with clean streams filled with salamanders, as you heard from Anne's letter at the beginning, statewide passenger train networks, solar and nuclear energy jobs, fertile soil for homegrown produce, well-funded public healthcare systems, and recreational tourism to rival the Rockies. People have said, West Virginia could be the Colorado of the East, and someone the other day on a Facebook post said maybe it's more the Idaho of the East. So I think either one would be great. But lots of wonderful ideas about the future of what West Virginia's land could support. And so inspired by this collective input, our design-led team really put pen to paper and envisioned a series of futures through just basically some simple renderings to show what these could look like, where we could start to layer some of these ideas together. And so, today we have many landscapes like you see here. This is kind of our before image, farmland that's cut through by a pipeline or an old mountaintop removal mining site. But what if we started to layer future uses on these lands, in addition to reclaiming the mountaintop site and restoring the soil? We could carve out new ATV trails and link up to larger networks that could cut through these sites, and also maybe provide reforestation programs to restore ecosystems while providing jobs. Or if we think about futures for old infrastructure, could we layer in new landscape infrastructure uses and connect regional rail to trail bike paths that are being proposed all across the country, and link up to those that could utilize this infrastructure, in addition to running parallel to more maybe river networks in the distance, have some mountainside solar farms that could provide energy locally and regionally. Or today we have farm collectives that are connecting farmers across the state, but what if we connect those farms to hiking trails and strategically connect communities and these destinations, such as these farms or grounds for hunting and foraging for both local residents and visitors, and provide alternative forms of connection. And in closing, our hope for the landscapes that we've imagined and the projects that have been documented in this report can really help build momentum for a new narrative for West Virginia and for a future that's even more wild and wonderful than it is today. And we wanted to leave just with another excerpt from a letter, one that feels particularly appropriate given the recent transition in presidential leadership. And this is from Emily Calandrelli, who's a former West Virginian. She lives on the West Coast now. Her family lives in Morgantown. She's a rocket scientist and she's a TV host on Netflix. Dear great-granddaughter, young people, including myself, were leaving the state because there simply weren't a lot of job options at home. But then something changed. The next generation started speaking up. They didn't want to leave. They knew things had to change. They marched in the streets. They started voting for people who fought for West Virginia's future instead of its past. P.S. The secret family recipe for pepperoni rolls is in the cupboard above the fridge at your mother's home. So with that, we'd love to open it up for conversation, Nick, and for Q&A for those who are here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was fantastic and a lot of really provocative thoughts and ideas that hopefully we can start to explore a bit more. To start, I wonder if we could focus on the land, since that is the sort of central through line, and specifically landowners or land ownership across the state, and that so much of the state is owned by corporate entities, timber, coal, and the federal government is now a major landowner, and these are all not local, and that there's a real issue with communities having control over their immediate environments and having that sort of agency when all of the land is actually owned by outside entities who may not even understand a local place or what have you. So could you first just maybe share a bit more about the situation in West Virginia on this front, and how communities are working either within the current sort of situation, or how they're looking to maybe transcend and to sort of engage new strategies around the land and land ownership?
Yeah, just to kick it off, and Caroline, I think it'd be nice to hear from you based on your research. I was quite frankly a little naive to this. I knew, growing up in West Virginia, that a lot of land is owned by companies. But when we were starting to dive into the public space theme, one of your questions to us was how much land is publicly owned in the state, and diving into that and recognizing that a majority of the land in West Virginia is not owned by people who live and work in the state. It's owned by outside interests. And so understanding that fundamentally, if we were to take this report and offer, suggestions for what the next steps are, at a core, when you're looking at land, it's about ownership. You can't just go in and do whatever you want to somebody else's land. And so understanding that more deeply could be an entire other American Roundtable report, quite frankly. But I think something that is really important to our understanding of how West Virginia land use and infrastructure and how the landscape has been used in the past to frame our kind of projections moving forward. But Caroline, maybe you could talk a little bit more about your research into this.
Yeah, so this is a huge question that I agree could be its own roundtable. I think the first step to tackling this issue is absolutely just transparency about ownership. So there's been a lot of studies into ownership, land ownership across Appalachia, starting in the late 70s, or it's kind of right after the floods that swept through a lot of the coal regions in 1977, that this became a really large topic. And what people found was that it was almost nearly impossible to figure out who owned what in the state, but that it was clear that it was primarily outside ownership and private ownership. So the kind of famous study is Who Owns Appalachia, which is a book folks can look up and probably check out of their local library, in 1980. And I mean, the figures are kind of staggering. It was like 1% of owners owned 44% of the land, 72% of the private land in the state was outside ownership, so kind of absentee owners. And that was like 80% of them. So then we also have to differentiate in West Virginia between surface ownership and mineral rights. And that's its own, the kind of brought the legacy.
That's a whole other thing. There's a three-dimensionality to the land ownership related to mineral rights and ownership that is something entirely different than I think, there's that three-dimensionality in New York when you're thinking about air rights, but it's kind of in the reverse. It's like what's under the ground and how do you own rights to your minerals.
And once surface mining became the predominant form of mining, mineral rights took precedence over surface rights. So owners who had lived on that land for generations were kicked off so people could blow up the mountain and get the coal out. And that was kind of like, I think at the 1980 study, there was like 300,000 people that owned surface rights, and about 50 private companies owned half of that. So 150,000 landowners had their underground mineral rights owned by about 50 people and kind of 10 government agencies. So it might be on the surface of the land that you have quite a few owners that you can find, but what's happening underground is massively different. And there have been recent studies by the Appalachia Land Study Group and also in West Virginia. And they're doing their data kind of differently, but it's like 25 owners own 20% of the land roughly in West Virginia right now. And those aren't government agencies. That's predominantly happening in the southern coal fields still, but it's shifted towards timber management elsewhere and kind of fracking rights. So really the question of land is still a huge one. And I think from my end, it's more it just takes so much labor for people to figure out who owns what. And if there's a centralized way of doing that, that would probably be a lot more helpful for everyone involved.
It's also a little confusing because there's rights that people own and then there's leases. So a lot of the land is owned by railroad companies or timber companies or big, like huge companies, but then tracts of the land are leased to coal companies, timber companies, those types of things. So a lot of it is owned by the railroad, but then when you're trying to parse out how much is leased to how many companies, and some of these leases are 100-year leases, and sometimes they'll sit on them to wait until whatever resource it is more valuable, which is makes sense for what they're using it for. So it gets super confusing when you look at leases too.
Yeah, and then the question is, it's when you're outside the state, you're often taxed at a different rate for that land. If you're leaving it as kind of mountain land or forest land, you have a different tax rate. So these leases and these ownerships for kind of the minerals underneath are often not being taxed at that level.
Have there been any efforts by either state government or someone else to think about this whole structure and how kind of it might impede people, being able to move ahead and to rebuild and rethink their communities? Or is it just all of the complication and various structures leading to inertia that, that there just hasn't been the necessary movement?
Yeah, so
Caroline, if you're, yeah.
I know a little bit about, this kind of goes back to the question of long-term versus short-term funding of projects and research. So a lot of the data I'm citing is for research that is, year to year scrambling for funding to figure this all out. And so it's not so much that maybe the state doesn't want to know, but that there's a lot of competing interests. And that is,
that's a good way to put it. A lot of competing interests, yeah.
I wanted to ask something that kind of follows up on that, and on a question of scale in both temporal and spatial terms. All of you talked a bit about short-term versus long-term and about the difficulties of connection across because of the nature of the landscape and also the nature of or the specific history of West Virginia and the influence of private companies. But what kind of structures or systems do you think are necessary for change to happen? Does it need to be from civil society somehow, or from government, and what level of government? I mean, what needs to change for change to happen?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one I think we're, as me coming at it from a design perspective and thinking about and seeing the work that everybody produced for this report, and one of the themes being kind of a history of short-term investment that then results in really crappy long-term outcomes, and that and even in Caroline's piece, looking at infrastructure and how that was built out just for the short-term gain of a corporate interest that then is sold off to a state, and they're kind of left holding the bag with infrastructure that fails. Or in Elaine's video, the research and highlighting that short-term grant cycles don't actually help the problems that they're trying to solve, because the minute that the grant cycle's over, everybody up and leaves. And for us as landscape architects and looking at land and how long-term investment is needed when you're putting an investment into land, and thinking about how do you shift the mindset around valuing long-term interest. And I think that fundamentally is a question for our country overall when you're thinking about climate change and larger environmental issues across the board. And part of what we're hoping this report can help say is that there is a reverence for the ground underneath us, for our land collectively, whether you're Republican or Democrat, or you work in a coal mine, or you used to, or you're interested in green solar jobs. It's all about the land. And so if there's a common ground that we can kind of understand and recognize is what we need to move forward long term, and that there is a requirement for long-term investment in these places and people in order to survive. We're hoping that maybe talking about it in that way can help shape that to move the conversation forward. That's kind of at a larger scale. And at a shorter scale, I think it really is convincing the state government and the federal government and even local level governments to be investing in their local places. And that does require more maybe government government intervention. But if we are working within the existing structures of grant cycles and foundations funding things, or nonprofits funding, or other organizations funding nonprofits to do the work, really thinking about longer term cycles for that. And I think Alftier's work for the public health theme that Elaine covered, he got a 5-year grant, which is long for a grant cycle, but in the span of land and landscape, that's like nothing. So for him, and for others, those grant cycles have to be longer. And he talks about how it's insane that social services are being funded in this way in 6-month grant cycles, and he comes from Iceland, where it's a more democratic social government, and social services aren't funded this way. And so fundamentally, I think there needs to be a shift that way. But I think working with the systems we have, it's about longer term funding streams to make these projects real.
I also think it's frustrating. What needs to change politically is big companies and corporations are always who we point our fingers at, and rightly so, but they also pay vast amounts of money in severance taxes. And the state has completely, I don't know where all that money, when coal was booming and we were the $1 billion coal fields and taxes were being paid. I mean, some companies will skirt it and some companies may pay less, but severance taxes have been collected and continue to be. And same with the natural gas booming. Where's that money? Where's the investment into the not just spending it today? I mean, it is constantly just feels like as a state, we're scrambling to figure out how to pay our bills. And I don't understand that. And that, I mean, it goes back to the economic theory of the resource curse. Places that have natural resources tend to have lower development outcomes. And I put a bit of responsibility also on the state government to answer the question of what happened with
accountability.
that. Yeah. And that funnels down to local government, which is full of corruption, and it's very hard. There's a question in the Q&A. It's very hard to get things done locally when you have old guards that have, corruption going about in places that are lesser seen and lesser known in small places.
Yeah, and I would just add on to the kind of where's the money going, that in West Virginia, as far as I know, it's one of the few states that's responsible for maintaining all of its roads. So in a lot of other places, a good percentage of the road network is receiving or is under the kind of oversight of federal funds, whereas in West Virginia, for some reason, is spending a lot more money on maintaining roads that were built for coal trucks. And so it's kind of like a perfect storm. And then also West Virginia is using that severance tax to service old bonds and old debts. And often those severance taxes are not going to the communities from which they kind of emerge. And so, it's going to the cities, the bigger cities, rather than the smaller communities that are producing that wealth.
Elaine had to go teach, so she had to hop off, but we thank her.
Wondering kind of back to, and what have you found, or what would you suggest in kind of working in these communities, the sort of balance between what exists and what needs to happen moving ahead that makes sense for a future? And Caroline, you mentioned all of these company towns and the sort of isolation, and it's obviously extraordinarily hard to say, well, this no longer is viable. Those are people's homes, those are people's places. But how do you balance the two and think about what a truly sort of sustainable and vibrant future might be, and balance the interests between sort of very local needs and then more regional or state needs?
I think, it's to me, my recommendation would be to use planning as a tool to answer those questions. I don't know the answers to those questions, and I think for the type of work we do, that's often the charge, is to find those answers. And through the work of planning and landscape architects being part of that planning, specifically for a state that has so much land, that would be my recommendation. And that planning should be led by communities that are interested in doing this in having something happen differently than what's happening now, and not be led by corporate interests or outside tourism interests that are, excited that West Virginia is 3 hours outside of DC, which I think is an incredible asset, but could very easily turn into something that might not support the communities that are there and the folks that are there already. And so, we in my own advocacy work in Pittsburgh, sitting on community development boards or doing work advocating for community benefits, we do our own master planning work that's funded through foundations or other organizations that pay to hire people who think about this kind of stuff, and to listen to the community and give voice and provide recommendations that are based on what the community wants to see, so that when someone comes in and wants to do something different, you have the tools at hand to say, no, actually collectively as people, we've decided that this is what we'd like to do, and you can fit into that, or because you're asking for a zoning variance, we're going to say no, and you can't do that. And so it's a balance of regulation and planning. And some of those tools just quite frankly aren't in some parts of West Virginia. Zoning often is thought of something that is the government controlling what you can do on your land, but I do think some of those tools may be framed in more contemporary ways to show the value of it for communities could be really helpful to move some of these big ideas forward, and to ensure that this is supporting who's there already and not creating something totally new in a place that doesn't want it.
And adding on to that, I think the focus on land that we took in this publication is really a challenge to think differently about planning and development. And so it seems to me that a lot of the focus when we look to small towns that are struggling or rural areas that are struggling is the first question folks ask is like, why don't they just move? And that's the history of these coal communities, is they got moved in, there was a bust, folks moved out. And that was tied to a logic of extractive capitalism and short-term investment. So if we're calling for thinking differently about how we invest in land and in communities, which is long-term, which is not based on a kind of extractive logic, then I think, like, I'm thinking of the renderings that Nina showed, which were a way of connecting people, places, economies, infrastructures that didn't necessarily look like how we've grown up thinking these things look. But do a similar service, but they kind of emerge from a long-term investment in a people and a place. And just to kind of like emphasize that these communities across West Virginia, like anyone who knows their labor history of the US knows that this is a part of the country that is just like, saturated in activism, organizing, and creativity. I think it's worth investing in that place.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point.
Nick, should we take some of the questions from the Q&A?
Sure. Let me just scroll here. One thing that someone was asking about is the idea of sort of generational knowledge transfer, and which I think kind of comes back to these questions of the sort of long-term reverence of the land that you were speaking of. Elaine's points of the idea of staying and leaving that Caroline just touched upon, and the sort of issues of brain drain. So the question is, how do you all envision the landscape's role in strengthening the connections between young and old to help keep that generational teaching going?
Yeah, I think it's already happening to some extent. In my generation, every summer and spring, my Instagram feed is filled with all my friends in West Virginia finding morel mushrooms or going hunting for pawpaw fruit and making food and doing all sorts of awesome stuff with the things that they're foraging for on their own land, or they go to a friend's land, or they were camping and doing that. And I do think that there's a shift happening just in the last 10, 15 years that's becoming more visible because of social media. I think it was there, but it's becoming more visible, and maybe hooking in a whole new generation of folks who are really interested in local food and all the things that we like to support. And so I think in that way that's starting to happen among certain folks who have the ability to and the time to do those things. I think, so, I'm coming at that from a perspective of a middle-class white lady whose friends are kind of similarly from a socioeconomic status. But I do think that there's a whole other part of that conversation that hasn't happened for a lot of folks, because it's a time and having the resources to do that kind of thing. And so I think there's a level of educational programs, and that's kind of some of the stuff that Elaine's video covers, and Alfier's work in looking at how to just set up sustained recreational programs through schools, which is an infrastructure that already exists, that in the public education system in West Virginia is actually has money in a variety of ways from these short-term grant cycles and other things to kind of build upon that existing infrastructure and create networks so that there's an education around what you can do in the landscape and introduce students to all the great assets that the state has. And so I think Elaine kind of touched on that in terms of, she mentioned Dolly Sods and Seneca Rocks, which are two incredible recreational destinations in the state that many students in West Virginia haven't even gone to. And so programs that could help support just knowledge that those things exist in and across the state would be really powerful, I think, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat that about in thinking differently about land and development, knowing coal should not have a future, what role does forestry have in that future? And I think something that may be underlying that question is, can timberlands be sustainably managed, and can there be, or is there being thought given in West Virginia to kind of vertical integration of the idea of growing timber and then how it's used in sustainable building, perhaps?
Yeah, Brittany Patterson's piece about work and economy touches on that, related to the spruce forest restoration work in the Monongahela National Forest, and that's just one example. There are a number of researchers that that I know from WVU, and I'm assuming there are others, and we just kind of scratched the surface in the report. Again, this could be a whole other report. And so there are people who are very much thinking about that and have been for a while. And so I understand that there are more contemporary practices for forestry that provide more sustainable outcomes, and kind of thinking about transition of timber practices over longer periods of time. Carolyn, I don't know if you know more.
Because of course timber predates coal in terms of kind of the extractive industries in the state. But today, so when we were talking about land ownership, there is still a large amount of absentee ownership in West Virginia, but that's shifted from the coal fields to timber management, which is not necessarily active timber management, but are kind of wealth funds. And so I think that's a whole nother round of research that's worth looking into. Like I know in the 80s, Harvard owned about 10,000 acres in East Kentucky, invested in oil and gas, paying no tax because we're a nonprofit. And now we own forests all over the world. And so I think this question of like forestry, forage management, timber management, and kind of needs a little bit of unpacking as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say a number of questions, or there's been two questions asking specifically about the indigenous community to West Virginia, and whether you have thoughts on that history, their presence today, their history of their removal, and how the futures you are thinking about might relate to that community.
Yeah, I would say we didn't do a deep dive, and I'm not going to claim that I have a lot of background knowledge. We do acknowledge the land ownership, the indigenous land ownership in the report, but I would say that we probably could have done a better job of highlighting that more in terms of history. Carolyn, I don't know if you have more knowledge of that, but I think that's something that we could include more of that in here. I also saw somebody mention that some of those ideas were included in a studio at Penn, one of the super studio Green New Deal studios about Appalachia, and Billy Fleming's course. I'm talking to Billy in a couple weeks about that. But I think it's really great that these ideas are being explored in studios related to Green New Deal and jobs and history of land from the very beginning. Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know if you want to say anything.
Like this kind of rediscovery of alternative ways of thinking through and with the land. Of course, like if we looked towards indigenous models of planning, practice, and engagement with the land in the U.S., like that is an incredibly like important starting point. And I've done obviously quite a bit of reading on that exists for Appalachia. There is a really great world systems book by Wilma Dunaway. It's kind of a bit older, where she draws on this kind of, rather than viewing Appalachia and this region of West Virginia as kind of isolated somehow, she's really interested in showing how it's been historically linked to the world kind of capitalist system. And she begins with indigenous groups in the region and their involvement in kind of various forms of like pelt trade, etc. So I think kind of bringing more of that knowledge to the fore, I think, will be important with any kind of work in the region moving forward.
I think one thing that we've touched on a few times, but there's a question that ties this together nicely, is the question of these futures being often around sort of recreation or tourism. And you were mentioning the trap of then that becoming its own sort of extractive industry. And this person was asking specifically about labor policy around that, and sort of labor being another source of extraction. And I think we see that in places like Vermont and Maine and Colorado, where it's service industry jobs. It's difficult to scale. They're not necessarily paying the same wages that would allow a middle class life that maybe a coal job had. So how does that fit into the puzzle?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that it comes back to this idea of, listening first to what the people of West Virginia want to see happen in these recreational landscapes that do exist today and are very well loved and do provide a source of economy at a certain scale in certain areas like Davis and Thomas and the Canaan Valley and Fayetteville and other places. The New River Gorge State Park has just now been named a national park. And so these places are already being used in that way. But, as there's continued interest and kind of this discovery of a place that is just like smack dab in the middle of the Eastern Seaboard, but like somehow it's now being discovered from the outside, there will need to be planning done to ensure that it doesn't erase what makes these places great today. And that's where I think the role of design advocacy and designers working with communities to help shape what that vision looks like moving forward is coming from the communities and not from outside in the reverse direction, because that's often what happens. A corporation has the means to do planning and they have the means to do the research and understand the legal issues around land ownership, and they come in and swoop up and scoop the land up from underneath you. And that has happened historically and could continue to happen. But if we have the tools in the hands of the people of West Virginia, then that way there's kind of like a preparedness quality that could help make sure that what happens next is defined by those who live there.
One of the themes through a lot of the parts of your report, and also through many other reports, is the centrality of food, which of course food is central in life, but the centrality of rethinking agricultural systems and food systems. And one of the interesting things in the discussion in Appalachia Rising is about the number of small farmers in West Virginia, but coupled with that, the difficulty those farmers have in bringing their products to market. So I know neither of you were the people who directly did the pieces on food, but do you want to say something about food systems and the food economy, and how it might be possible to sustain small farmers while also making that a more viable way of life?
Yeah, it's so Brittany Patterson's piece in the Work and Economy section, she talks about the Turner Appalachian Farm Collective, which is a group of farmers that have collectively invested in systems that can support multiple smaller farms. So in terms of distribution networks and kind of equipment, and there's kind of this like crowdsourced sharing of space and tools. Is allowing smaller farms to kind of access the resources of a larger farm. And I think, you know, smaller farms in West Virginia are a product of the land, and that there isn't a lot of flat land to farm. And so the farms that exist are small because of the available flat land. And so I think that piece was very interesting to me too, because she, in talking with them recently over the course of this year, they've all seen an incredible uptick in the amount of food they're selling locally out the door to individuals. So originally they were set up to sell their food to restaurants or distributors who are distributing food to restaurants or larger kind of food systems and schools and providing lunches and things. But because of COVID and the inability to access groceries and not wanting to go to grocery stores, they've all seen an uptick in individuals accessing their farms and buying food more locally because it's safer. And because the food system structure was disrupted, especially in the early stages of the pandemic, where shipping delays and all sorts of things were interrupting how larger grocery store chains were getting food. And so in some ways, you know, this kind of reverting back to the smaller scale, more distributed model is in many ways how we talk about resiliency from a stormwater management perspective or from a sea level rise perspective, you know, going back to like smaller site scale kind of approaches that are more localized and can provide more resilient social systems instead of these large scale one size fits all kind of solutions for food, provides the resiliency related to food systems right now that we're seeing through the pandemic to some extent. I mean, in other areas it's not as supported by local farms, so it's still an issue, but I think there's some interesting parallels there to consider, and coming back to this idea of just local food and that being something that if you can get that into the hands of people who need it is a much you know, a safer way to get the food out. And Rebecca's piece related to the Grow Ohio Valley group in Wheeling, West Virginia, you know, half of their work is distribution and recognizing that it wasn't just about growing the healthy food, it was about how do you get that healthy food to the people in Wheeling, and being very strategic about how to get food so they get funding so that they can hand out free food to kids at after school pickup times, and they're with their mobile food truck are able to give free food away that they are growing, and the mobile truck can go around to the different schools. And then they have the public market in downtown Wheeling that is next to the main bus terminal. And so strategically locating themselves there, one, because they're downtown, but two, because they're accessing the folks who are coming on and off the buses have access to fresh food, and it's not an inconvenience to go get fresh food. So making things front and center and linking that up into this distribution network.
So I think we are kind of reaching the end of time, but there was one question about how dissemination might work and how, you know, all of these ideas might reach communities. And I can start by saying that, you know, one of the goals of American Roundtable is to very much have this conversation across the US and into these communities. And one thing that we're sort of saying is that we really want these reports to be of the place, not about the place, and to engage the perspectives of local residents and to hear from them and with them and to have these conversations. So as the months go by, we are hoping to really make sure that this gets pushed into communities and that conversation can be sustained at that level. But Nina and Caroline, maybe to finish off, in the idea of changing narratives and the idea of looking to the future, what do you really see as the sort of the best way to do that in talking with people, in engaging communities, and to not be, you know, caught into stale narratives, or someone else had mentioned the word nostalgia of certain kinds, and how we have this conversation that's really forward-looking and can build the change that needs to happen? Yeah,
it's a great question. And I think for us, it's when thinking about our role in this large puzzle, and it's a small role, but it is a role as landscape architects, I think what we can really offer, and I kind of said at the beginning, is what all these reports are offering is optimism and hope. And that was also our intention with inviting folks to write letters into a future that is way off into the distance, and a future that's not even for them, it's for their family. So people who don't even exist today. And by kind of switching that in terms of, instead of saying like, what do you want to see in the future? It's like, what do you want for your kin in the future? It allows people to think, kind of unlock from the daily grind and the kind of day-to-day immediacy of problems that are happening that are very real, and we recognize and acknowledge them. But our role as designers is to really be thinking about the future and how to unlock that potential for folks. And then, and so the letter writing exercise was just such a nice way to capture those thoughts from everybody and collectively have a conversation with each of them about what they want to see for the state in the future. And then for us to visualize them and say, this is a potential. Those hopes and dreams get captured in these graphics that kind of speaks to this idea of representation and what the output is, that then those can be things to look forward to, and to be able to couple that with examples that are happening all across the state right now that are already happening, that this isn't something that we have to wait 100 years for. These are things that are already happening. And so isn't that exciting? And if there's a food collective in Alderson, West Virginia, why can't that happen in another part of the state? And inspiring through precedent, which we also use as a tool as designers to inspire our work, looking at precedents to say, this is possible for you too, that could provide optimism and hope moving forward.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, to not remain siloed in our disciplines or in the kind of media spheres our disciplines travel in. And, I'm more on the academic side, so I'm much more guilty of this probably, but like, what does public scholarship look like? What is the role of, what can historians do to help all of these organizations and groups that are active on the ground in a sustained and really committed way? So that the things we're producing and thinking and learning and digging out of archives and boxes find their way to the people who could really use it for the work they're doing.
Yeah, and thank you to the Architectural League for giving an outlet for all of this, because I think it's been really powerful for everybody, our team, and then all the other teams too, to be able to really dig into this work.
Well, on behalf of the League, thank you both so much, and all of your collaborators. I mean, it's an amazing team you put together, as you said, an all-woman team. I know Sarah Raffson, I think, is attending, but you guys did a great job, and it's not only deeply interesting, the report that you put together, but deeply moving too, and very hopeful.